That day was amazing. It all started a couple months ago. Let me get you right into the moment. I knew something was different the moment he walked through the door. There was a shift in the air, an almost imperceptible change that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. It wasn't just the way he looked at me, though there was something new in his eyes. A hesitation, a question. It was the weight between us, the silence. Like something unsaid was hanging there, waiting to drop. He didn't close the door behind him immediately. Instead, he lingered, standing in the doorway as if he wasn't sure whether to come in fully. His footsteps were slow and deliberate when he finally did move, the sound of them tapping against the hardwood floor echoing louder than they should have. It was like he was counting each step, like each one was calculated, a way to measure the distance that had grown between us over the months. Neither of us spoke. The last time we saw each other, words had failed us then too, but in a different way. That day had been filled with arguments, accusations, and truths we weren't ready to face. When he left, it wasn't just him walking out of the door. He had taken something more. He had taken the quiet stability that life used to have and left a void in its place. One that was filled with all the things we never talked about, all the things we both tried to avoid. And now here he was back again, as though no time had passed. But it had. And time changes things. Time forces you to face the things you've been running from, the things you buried deep inside. Time makes you realize that some wounds never really heal. They just fester under the surface, waiting for the right moment to break open again. I didn't think you'd come back. I finally said, breaking the silence that had grown too heavy, too thick to bear any longer. He shrugged like it was the most natural thing in the world, like the months of silence between us didn't matter. I didn't think I would either. There was something off about his voice, something tentative. It wasn't like him. He was always so sure of himself, always the one who knew exactly what to say. But not now. Now, he seemed uncertain, almost hesitant, and that scared me more than anything. I watched him carefully, waiting for him to say more, but he just stood there, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his jacket, his shoulders hunched slightly, the way they always were when he was nervous. He wasn't here for small talk. That much was clear. This wasn't the kind of visit where we'd pretend everything was fine, catch up on lost time, and go our separate ways. No, this was something else, something bigger, something neither of us had the courage to face before. "You're different," he said quietly, his eyes locking onto mine in a way that made my stomach twist. "So are you?" I replied, my voice sounding far calmer than I felt. Inside, I was a mess, a whirlwind of emotions that I wasn't ready to confront. I hadn't expected to feel this way seeing him again. I thought I'd moved on, thought I'd buried all of this. But here he was, standing in front of me, and all those old feelings came rushing back, crashing over me like a wave I couldn't stop. There was a long pause between us, a silence so thick it felt like a third presence in the room, watching us, judging us. His gaze didn't falter, and neither did mine, even though every part of me wanted to look away, to break the tension that seemed to grow with every second that passed. But I couldn't. Something kept me there, rooted to the spot, like this moment was too important to let slip away. "Why now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, but the words seemed to echo in the quiet of the room. He took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling slowly, but his eyes never left mine, because I couldn't keep pretending anymore. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had braced myself for a lot of things, anger, frustration, even indifference, but not this. Not honesty. My heart pounded against my ribs, and I struggled to find something to say, but the words seemed to stick in my throat. What was there to say? He had left, and I had moved on, or at least that's what I told myself. But now, standing here face to face with him, all the walls I'd built around myself began to crumble. "You didn't have to come back," I said finally, though my voice shook despite my best efforts to keep it steady. "But I did," he said firmly, his voice unwavering now, as if he had found his resolve. "And we both know why." I swallowed hard. the weight of his words settling over me like we both knew what had been left unsaid between us, and no amount of time or distance could erase that. I tried to push those thoughts away, tried to pretend that things could go back to the way they were before, but they couldn't. Normal didn't exist anymore. Not for us. "I can't do this again," I whispered, taking a step back, though the space between us felt impossibly small, like the room itself was closing in around us. He didn't move. He didn't even flinch. "I'm not asking you to," he said softly, his eyes never leaving mine. "I'm just asking you to listen." Something in his voice stopped me from running. Maybe it was the sincerity I heard, the vulnerability. Or maybe it was because deep down, I knew he was right. I couldn't avoid this forever, no matter how much I wanted to. We were both standing at the edge of something we couldn't walk away from. But the story didn't end there. How could it? There was too much between us, too many things left unresolved. I nodded slowly, not trusting my voice to say anything, and motioned for him to sit down. He hesitated for a moment, then moved to the couch, sitting down carefully, like he was afraid of breaking something fragile. I stayed standing, too anxious to sit, my hands gripping the back of the chair in front of me, as if it were the only thing keeping me grounded. "I didn't come here to make things harder for you," he said after a long moment, his voice low, almost apologetic. I couldn't keep pretending like nothing happened. The words hung in the air between us, heavy with the weight of everything we'd been through. I opened my mouth to say something, to tell him that I didn't need his apologies, that I had moved on. But that would have been a lie, and I was tired of lying, tired of pretending. "You think I haven't thought about you every day since you left?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "You think it's been easy for me to just move on?" His eyes flickered with something, regret maybe? Or was it something else? He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped together. "I didn't know," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "No." You felt the same. I felt my heart clench painfully at his words. I didn't know how to respond to that, didn't know how to make sense of the emotions swirling inside me. We had to face it, no matter how much it hurt. But facing it meant opening old wounds, and I wasn't sure either of us was ready for that. The silence that followed was unbearable. Every second felt like an hour, and I could hear the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. We sat there, not looking at each other, the weight of our conversation hanging over us like a dark cloud. I had wanted to avoid this moment for so long, but now it was here, and there was no escaping it. "You don't get it," I said, my voice quieter now but no less strained. "You left, and I had to pick up the pieces. I had to figure out how to move on, how to live with—" He cut me off, his voice rising slightly, though there was still a note of control in it. "I know I messed up, okay? I know I should have stayed, but I couldn't. Not then." "Why not?" The question came out before I could stop it, sharper than I intended. "Why couldn't you just stay? You left me with nothing." He stood up then, pacing back and forth in front of the couch, running his hands through his hair. The movement only made the tension in the room worse, as if the walls themselves were closing in on us. Because I was scared, he shouted, and the sound of it startled me. I was scared of what it all meant, of how I felt. I couldn't handle it, and I didn't know how to stay and face you. The words hit me like a slap. He had never said anything like this before, not once. All the anger, all the frustration that had built up in me for months seemed to bubble to the surface at that moment. "You were scared?" I repeated, my voice shaking with a mixture of disbelief and anger. "You think I wasn't?" He stopped pacing then, turning to look at me, his expression one of shock. "What?" I felt my breath catch in my throat, and for a moment I didn't know what to say. I hadn't meant to let that slip out. I hadn't meant to let him know that he wasn't the only one who had been confused, who had been afraid of what was happening between us. But it was too late now. The truth was out there, and there was no taking it back. "I was scared too," I whispered, looking down at my hands. But I didn't run. I didn't leave. Building, thickening the air around us. He took another step closer, and I could feel the heat of his body, the way it seemed to radiate towards me, pulling me in. My pulse quickened, and I found myself frozen in place, unable to move, unable to think clearly. "You should have told me," he said, his voice softer now. But there was something dark in it, something that sent a shiver down my spine. We could have figured it out together. I shook my head, finally finding my voice again. No, we couldn't. It wasn't that simple. Why not? He moved even closer, and now there was barely any space between us. I could feel his breath on my skin, and it sent a jolt of electricity through me. We could have tried. My heart pounded in my chest, and I tried to take a step back, but there was nowhere to go. He was too close now, too much in my space, and the room felt too small, too suffocating. "This isn't right," I whispered, though my voice sounded weak, even to my own ears. "Why not?" he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper now. His eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. "No one has to know. It's just us, just you and me." I shook my head again, trying to clear the fog that seemed to have settled over my thoughts. "We can't," I whispered, but the words felt hollow. And then, before I could say anything else, before I could even process what was happening, he leaned in, closing the small distance between us, and kissed me. The shock of it sent a wave of heat through my entire body. His lips were soft against mine, tentative at first, as if he wasn't sure how I would react. But I didn't pull away. I couldn't. My body seemed to have a mind of its own, and before I knew what I was doing, I was kissing him back. It was like something snapped inside me, something I had been holding back for far too long. All the emotions I had kept bottled up, all the things I had refused to acknowledge, they all came rushing to the surface at that moment. I couldn't stop. I didn't want to. The kiss deepened until there was no space left between us. My heart was racing, my pulse pounding in my ears, and for a moment, it felt like the world around us had disappeared. There was no past, no future, just this moment, just the two of us. But then, reality came crashing back in. I pulled away, gasping for breath, my mind spinning with everything that had just happened. What had we done? How had we let it get this far? My heart was racing, my chest tight with a mixture of fear and something else, something I didn't want to name. "This is wrong," I whispered, stepping back, trying to put some distance between us. "We can't do this." But he didn't move. He just stood there, his eyes locked on mine, his expression unreadable. "Why not?" he asked, his voice low, almost dangerous. "Who says we can't?" My stomach churned and I shook my head, trying to clear the fog that had settled over my thoughts. "This isn't right. You know it isn't." He stepped closer again, closing the distance I had just created. "I have already told you. No one has to know," he whispered, his voice soft but insistent. "It can just be our secret." I swallowed hard, my throat tight, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts I couldn't organize. Every instinct told me to run, to put as much space between us as possible. But my body didn't move. It was like I was frozen in place, unable to do anything but stand there and let this happen. His hand brushed against mine, and I felt that same jolt of shoot through me again. My heart pounded in my chest, my pulse racing, and I didn't know what to do. "Don't fight it," he whispered, his hand moving to rest on my waist again, pulling me closer. "You know this feels right." And the terrifying part was, a small part of me believed him. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, staring down into the abyss, knowing that once I stepped forward, there was no turning back. The space between us was shrinking, but the weight of what was about to happen was heavier than anything I had ever felt before. For a moment, I felt paralyzed, trapped in the tension between what I knew was wrong and what my body was telling me was inevitable. The air in the room seemed thicker, heavier, like it was pressing down on us, urging us closer together. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in shallow gasps as the reality of the moment sank in. I should have stopped him. I should have pulled away, told him that we couldn't do this, that it wasn't right. But the truth was, a part of me didn't want to. A part of me had been waiting for this moment, had been building up to it for months, maybe even years. And now that it was here, it felt like all the tension, all the unspoken words between us were finally about to explode. We stumbled backward, barely able to stay upright as we moved toward the couch. My mind was spinning, my thoughts a jumble of confusion, desire, and fear. But none of that seemed to matter at that moment. All that mattered was him. The way he touched me, the way he made me feel like nothing else in the world existed. Time seemed to blur as we fell onto the couch, our bodies tangling together in a mess of limbs and heat. Every touch, every kiss sent sparks through me, igniting something inside me that I hadn't even realized was there. I wanted him, no, I needed him. In a way that terrified me, but I couldn't stop. I didn't want to stop. We moved together in a rhythm that felt both familiar and new, like we had been doing this for years, but also like it was the first time. The world outside disappeared, leaving just the two of us, caught in a moment that felt both timeless and forbidden. It was raw, it was real, and it was happening. But at that moment, I didn't care. I didn't care about the consequences, didn't care about the guilt or the fear or the confusion that would inevitably come later. All I cared about was him, the way he made me feel, the way he was looking at me like I was the only thing in the world that mattered. It was wrong, but it felt so right, and I couldn't bring myself to stop. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, but none of them made sense. All I could focus on was him, his touch, his breath, the way he made me feel like I was coming apart and being put back together all at once. And then in one final, breathless moment, it happened. The tension between us finally broke, and everything we had been holding back came rushing out in a flood of emotion, desire, and need. It was intense, overwhelming, and I felt like I was drowning in it, but in the best possible way. When it was over, we lay there in silence, our bodies still tangled together, our breathing ragged. The weight of what had just happened began to settle over me, heavy and suffocating. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even think. All I could do was lie there and try to make sense of what we had just done. My heart was still racing, my body trembling from the intensity of it all. But as the adrenaline began to fade, reality came crashing back in. The guilt, the shame, the fear. They were all there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to swallow me whole. I pulled away from him, sitting up slowly, my hands shaking as I tried to steady myself. "We need to stop," I whispered, my voice barely audible, but the words felt like they weighed a ton. He didn't say anything at first, he just lay there, his chest rising and falling as he caught his breath. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, almost gentle. "I know," he said, his eyes meeting mine, "but you can't tell me it didn't feel right." I looked away, my stomach churning with a mixture of emotions I couldn't even begin to unravel. It had felt right, too right, but that didn't make it any less wrong. What had we done? How had we let it get this far? "We can't do this again," I said, my voice shaking as I stood up, grabbing my clothes and pulling them back on as quickly as I could. This was a mistake. He sat up, watching me carefully, his expression unreadable. "Maybe," he said slowly, "but I think we both know this wasn't just a one-time thing." I froze, my heart skipping a beat at his words. I wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that he was wrong, that this would never happen again. But the truth was, I wasn't sure I believed that anymore, and that terrified me more than anything else. I stood there for what felt like forever, staring at him, the weight of his words pressing down on me, my heart raced in my chest, and I could feel my mind spinning, searching for something, anything that would make sense of what had just happened. But nothing did. Nothing about this made sense. "I'm serious," I whispered, more to myself than to him. "This can't happen again." He didn't respond right away, just watched me with those same intense eyes that had drawn me in from the start. There was something almost unreadable in his expression, something that both scared me and made me want to understand. It was a quiet kind of resolve, a belief that this was only the beginning. "You say that," he finally said, his voice calm but firm. "But we both know it's not over." I opened my mouth to protest, to argue, but the words wouldn't come. He wasn't wrong. As much as I wanted to deny it, as much as I wanted to pretend that this could be the end of whatever was happening between us, I knew deep down that it wasn't. There was something between us that couldn't be undone, something that had taken root and was only growing stronger. But admitting that, to him or to myself, felt impossible. "We'll make it stop," I said, more to convince myself than him. "It has to stop." "You don't believe that." His voice was low, steady, like he knew something I didn't, or maybe like he knew something I was too afraid to admit. And I don't think I believe it either. I couldn't meet his gaze anymore, couldn't face the truth that was hanging between us. Instead, I turned away, my hands shaking as I fumbled to get dressed. My mind raced, trying to latch on to anything that would make the situation feel less overwhelming, less out of control. But nothing worked. "You can't just walk away from this," he said. And I could hear the frustration creeping into his voice now. "You can't pretend like we didn't do anything." I spun around, my anger flaring up as I finally found my voice. "We can't just act like this is normal. We can't keep doing this." He stood up then, his expression hardening as he took a step closer. "Why not?" he asked, his voice rising. "Why can't we? No one else knows." I shook my head, taking a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. "Because it's wrong," I whispered, my voice shaking with emotion. "You know it is." For the first time, I saw something flicker in his eyes, a crack in the confidence he had been holding on to so tightly. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by the same determined look he had been wearing all along. "You keep saying that," he said, his voice quiet but insistent. "But I don't think you really believe it." I felt the frustration rising in me again, the anger, the confusion, all of it swirling together into a storm I couldn't control. "What do you want from me?" I shouted, my voice breaking. "What do you want me to say?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped closer, his eyes never leaving mine. "I want you to be honest," he said, his voice softened now. "I want you to tell me the truth." I swallowed hard, my throat tight as I tried to steady my breathing. The truth. The truth was, I didn't know what I wanted. I didn't know what was right or wrong anymore. All I knew was that I was standing in front of him, and the pull between us was stronger than ever. But I couldn't give in again. I couldn't. "You can't just expect me to forget about everything else," I said, my voice barely above a whisper now. "This changes everything." I shook my head, my hands trembling as I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to hold onto some semblance of control. "It already has," I whispered. "It already has ruined everything." His expression softened then, and for a moment, I saw something vulnerable in his eyes, something I hadn't seen before. He reached out, his hand gently brushing against my arm, and I felt my heart skip a beat at the contact. "We don't have to let it," he said softly, his voice full of something like hope. "We can make this work. We just have to be honest with each other." I stared at him, my mind reeling with everything that had happened, everything that was happening. He made it sound so simple, like we could just choose to make this work, and everything would fall into place. But I knew it wasn't that easy. Nothing about this was easy. He sighed, dropping his hand and stepping back. The distance between us felt both like a relief and like a loss, and I wasn't sure which one hurt more. "Then, tell me you don't feel the same way," he said, his voice low, almost pleading now. "Tell me you don't want this as much as I do." I couldn't say it. The words stuck in my throat, refusing to come out, because the truth was, I did want it. I wanted him, but wanting something didn't make it right. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice breaking. I can't." He nodded slowly, his expression resigned. "I guess that's your answer then." We stood there in silence for what felt like an eternity, neither of us knowing what to say, what to do. The tension that had been building between us for so long had finally snapped, and now all that was left was a wreckage. I didn't know how to fix it. I didn't know if it could be fixed. I should go. I finally said, my voice barely audible, I need some time to think. He didn't stop me. He didn't say anything at all. He just stood there, watching as I grabbed my things and headed for the door, my heart heavy with the weight of everything that had happened between us. As I walked out, I felt like I was leaving a part of myself behind. But I couldn't stay. Not now. Not when everything was so uncertain, so broken. What we had shared left a mark, something neither of us could easily forget or ignore. It had shifted something inside us, changing the way we saw each other and ourselves. As I stood there, the weight of it all pressing on my chest, I realized that leaving wouldn't erase what had happened. The distance between us might have grown, but there was something that still lingered in the air, unspoken and undeniable. I stepped toward the door, my heart racing, feeling the gravity of what we had just gone through. As I walked out, the silence around me felt heavy, as if the memory of it would follow me wherever I went.